On the Security Plus exam, you can expect a few questions that might test your knowledge of command line syntax. And this is an example of that type of question. So the scenario begins with, you have deployed a new on-premises Linux virtual machine. Organizational security policies require SSH public key authentication as opposed to username and password authentication for Linux hosts. What is the correct order of commands to enable SSH public key authentication? And the question then asks, drag the steps on the left and place them in the correct sequence on the right. So clearly we have 4 commands on the left, but there's only 3 placeholders on the right. So one of them is not going to be used. So let's take a look at the correct answer. Now the first thing you need to do to set up SSH public key authentication is you need to generate the public and private key pair. And that's what's being done with SSH-keygen. Now, presumably you would be doing this from your host that you're going to be using to connect to the server. You could do this directly on the server, but in this case, let's just assume that we're doing it on a client machine, which means that we then have to somehow get the public key to the server. And that's where the second command comes in, SSH-copy-ID. What this does is it allows us to log into our remote Linux host, copy the public key file, which we're specifying here as the second parameter on our local machine. It copies that to the appropriate location on the server, and it also puts that public key in a file called authorized_keys. That's all on the server. So the public key has to be in that authorized keys file. So that's what's happening in the second example. We are specifying, again, with the second parameter, our local public key that we want to copy to the server. And then with user at host, we're specifying the credentials to actually log into the server to do that. Finally, the last thing that we're doing is just testing it out. So SSH-I, the -I means identity file. In this case, we're pointing to our local private key file. Now that private key file in this specific example is under the user's home directory on the local client host. Now that's referenced in Linux with the tilde symbol. Then within the hidden.ssh folder, and it's called priv for private.key. So we're telling it this is the private key we want to use to authenticate to the remote host, and then we pass it our username and then the remote host name or IP address. So really what's happening in these 3 steps is we are setting up SSH public key authentication, and then we're actually testing it out.